All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for this awesome crowd and for our amazing panels that we'll be introducing in seconds. So before we start, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Rim Harris, and I am a final PhD student here at MIT in the Operation Research Center. And a fun fact about me is today is my birthday, and I am turning 20-something, let's just say that. And so my research is actually very related to the topic of today. I work in data-driven optimization, particularly in the space of pricing, revenue management, but also I've worked in transportation, which is linked to what we are going to talk about today. So we have a great panelist for us today. The topic is not necessarily only mattering to people who work as data scientists, computer scientists, like MIT folks here, but also what we hope to show today is that this is an important matter for also people who are in governance and who are going to be taking decisions, thus data-driven decisions, right? So what I want this to be is a lively exchange of ideas. And what we want to talk about is how is data-driven decision can help improve the future of our cities, particularly in the MENA region. So if you have any anecdotes about that, that would be great. And before we start, I'm pleased to present our great panelists. So I'll start from the furthest, which is Dr. Soufiane Bar. So Dr. Soufiane Bar is a senior software engineer and a researcher at the Qatar Computing Research Institute. And he leads the urban computing activity at QCRI with a specific focus on using AI and data-driven techniques to tackle big urban challenges. So related to mapping road networks, traffic congestions, mobility, air pollution, resilience. And he has initiated several projects, not only in academia, but also in industry. So he's in the perfect place to talk about collaborations between industry and academia as well. He took his PhD from the University of Versailles in Saint-Quentin-en-Yvelines in France, and his CS engineering degree from École Supérieure d'Informatique in Algeria. Our second panelist is Professor Dr. Munther Dahleh, who is the William A. College professor at ECS, here at MIT. Some of you probably already know him. And he's the founding director of the newly founded institute, the IDSS, or the MIT Institute of Data, Systems and Society. He received his PhD from Rice University in Texas, Houston, and in electrical engineering and computer science. And since then, 1987, he has been with the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT. And his work is in the network system with application to social and economic networks, financial networks, and transportation networks. So networks particularly, but mostly in transportation as well. And in particular, he is interested in the development of foundational theory necessary to understand, monitor, and control systemic risk in interconnected systems. And finally, last but not least, Rida Qadri, who is a doctoral student in the Urban Information System at MIT. Her work focuses on the interactions between emerging digital platforms and informal mobility markets. She has been using very novel data sets to showcase how spatial analytics can help understand the dynamics of cities. So, for example, some of her past work has been looking at using satellite imagery to study displacement of streets, markets in Mexico City. She has also utilized a mix of administrative data sets to map inequitable policy of sidewalk vending in New York City. And she also used network analysis to measure the equity of low-cost food distribution in Singapore. So you could see our panelists are the top experts in their fields. They have looked at data-driven decision, and particularly they've been working in the urban system area. So I will start this panel by a very open question. So as probably most of us know, that data now is kind of a new currency. All types of institutions are racing to acquiring data. So whether by collecting data somehow, buying data from third-party institutions. Even you'll find a lot of companies now, they have this new positions like CIO, Chief Information Officer, who are basically interested in data acquisition. CMO positions are more targeted into like how do we do marketing better with using particular novel data sets. So you can see that's something we already have seen. But less is known about how is this data actually used to make decisions. So thus, the term of data-driven decision is not necessarily well explained. So my question would be, what constitutes for you what we call a data-driven decision, and what is, in your experience, the current state of data-driven decisions, both in urban systems or in the MENA region, if you have encountered that? So maybe, Sufyan, you could start that if you want.
Okay, thank you, Reem, for the introduction, and thank you very much for having us actually in this panel. I think as a data scientist, I will try to focus on the data aspect of data-driven decisions. And as such, I think nobody would disagree if I say that our cities have turned to be like big data generators. And indeed, there's a lot of data that's being generated on a daily basis in all our cities. And if we look at the different dynamics that the cities actually are trying to capture in terms of data, this can be actually grouped and categorized into three main classes. We have data coming from physical sensors, right? These are sensors that we deploy in different parts of the city to capture things like number of roads, number of cars passing different intersections, or the level of power consumption in different buildings or neighborhoods, level of water usage in different apartments, and so on and so forth. And then the second source of data is this business/organization sensor, where we have a lot of businesses, government agencies that generate lots of reports about, like hospitals, for instance, number of beds, number of patients admitted in different services, and so on and so forth. And finally, we have what we call data coming from human sensors. This is us, the citizens, who generate huge amounts of data as we interact with our urban environment, and that we push through social media platforms, blogs, and websites. So this kind of data could be as simple as an image that we post on Instagram about a pizza slice that we have in our favorite restaurant, or an accident that we report that's creating like a huge junction in certain highway, or we are reporting taxi driver who is overspeeding in some part of the city. Now, the main challenge actually in data-driven decisions is to try to civilize this huge amount of heterogeneous data, and I really like the term civilization of data, because at QCRI, actually, we have a project with CSA and MIT called Data Civilizer, where we try to integrate and fuse data coming from different sources to make this data actually available for data scientists to extract knowledge and information from it and turn it into actionable actions and items. Now, if you wonder why is data important in the urban systems, in the urban space, let's see what the UN actually says about number of people who live in urban areas nowadays. The statistics says that we are 55% of the whole global population who lives in urban areas, and the projections is that by 2050 we will be like 70%. Now, if you don't know what does this rapid urbanization bring in terms of stress and problems to cities, then I would highly recommend you to come and visit Doha in Qatar, where the population growth rate, the annual one, is around 10%. So just think about it. Every year, the city needs to accommodate 10% more people in terms of power, water, energy, schools, and hospitals, and whatnot. So this huge stress has pushed the government to very quickly realize that in addition to expanding its resources, like building new roads, building new hospitals, they needed to try to leverage on the data they have in order to rationalize and increase the efficiency of the resources that already exist. And this is actually why they try to reach out to different data science institutions and research labs to try to figure out whether we could do something with the data that's generated by different entities to answer these questions.
Thank you, Sufyan. I will turn the mic to you, Dr. Munther.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. So thanks for the invitation to the panel. So let me just kind of start setting the tone a little bit about the fact that data has always been important for making decisions. This is not a new phenomenon. This is hundreds of years old phenomenon. The scientific discovery process is based on collecting data, building models, then invalidating the models through more data, and then building new models, and you continue the process. So this is not new, and that's important to recognize that didn't just fall on us a few years ago. But a few things have changed Okay, and I think it's important to, and what I'm going to mention is not everything that has changed. But one thing is that we have a lot more data that we can centralize in one location. So we can measure more data, which is really important. And we can do things in real time. And so because of computation, we're able to process and then make decisions in real time. That actually affects the dynamics of every phenomenon we're looking at, transportation, power, whatever it is. Real time is really critical. And the third component is that we're collecting data about people and their behavior. Okay, and that we're trying to incorporate into our understanding of infrastructures. And we don't know how to do that because we don't understand how people behave. We can write papers about how people behave, but we don't understand how people behave. And so we're struggling taking that data into the loop for understanding problems in urban science and infrastructure in particular. And I think that is research to come. I think it's important. This data is also available in real time, and you can collect it rather cheaply, actually. But its usage, if it's not done correctly, has terrible consequences. And this is a place where there's some caution that we have to exercise.
Great. Rida, do you want to contribute to basically the same question I'll be asking you? Like, what has been your experience with data-driven decisions? What do you think about the state of it so far?
So I agree with what Professor Munther said. Using data to drive decision-making is not new. I would just like to add that what is also new is the granularity at which data is available. So mostly before, cities used data at pre-made aggregations, so whether that was the census block, whether that was the neighborhood. Now we have data that's available for, as you said, individual behavior. What we still don't have, though, is while we can observe behavior, we don't have any understanding of the intentionality behind that behavior. And this is particularly problematic when we use data generated in the use of public space, when we use data from social media, Twitter, Facebook, especially because within a lot of those systems, certain kind of behavioral incentives are baked into the system design, which leads to certain kind of behavior. So one concern that I've always had is when you look at a large data set that's been generated by, let's say, mobility patterns or the way people are walking, are they walking on those paths because that's where they want to walk? Or are they walking on those paths because that is where the sidewalks are? Or are they walking on those paths because that's where they feel safer? So while we have granular data, we have large-scale data, we have data that seems to be covering a lot of different populations, I think I agree with what my fellow panelists said. It's important to recognize the both geographical and social blind spots of the current data, both in terms of geographies within cities, but also global geographies of what are the large swaths of population that aren't being counted in our current data generating process.
I think you all made excellent points. So you actually showed that the problem is not necessarily the not having the data, but scalability issues that come from having too much data, but also granularity of it that doesn't necessarily help you get a better understanding of the data, which means there might be some problems which leads me to my second question about what are the key pain points that you probably have faced when you have worked on your research product or with industry with data, whether it's on the data part or on the data decision part. So from data to models to decisions, there is a long road, and you can have hurdles in each particular part of it. So I just want you to basically talk from your experience, what were these particular key pain points? Whoever wants to start, maybe if that'll be...
Okay, so a couple of things. So first of all, on the data side, I think you said right from the beginning that data is the new currency, right? And I think that this is a very interesting sort of description, and data has become so important. Companies have changed their whole business model around the data that they have. Just watch what happened to GE as a company. It's a huge transformation. So data is very important. Everybody's out there buying data, collecting data, and a lot of this data is not used. So one aspect of this is, well, if it's such an important commodity, how do you price it? How do you actually pay for data? We, at IDSS, we work with several data companies, and we are intrigued by the whole idea of the fact that, the way they sell their data sets. It's all based on fear tactics. Your competitors have got this data, might as well get this data. We'd like you to get the largest possible contract. So, if you can buy it for 10 years, we'll give you a discount and we'll hook you up. Some data is operational, and so that's useful, and you know exactly what to do with it. But other data, well, aspirational. Can I use this data to figure out how to run my hedge fund better or something like that? So as a commodity, it's important. People are paying money for it, but it doesn't have intrinsic value. As a result, the pricing of data has become very complicated. And every company I talk to come back and say, we don't know how much money we should pay for this data. And this is, I think, one of the pains that we definitely observe. In going from data to decisions, I think you have a classical problem where the data itself contains a lot of decisions embedded in it. This happened because a certain policy was in place or a certain decision strategy was in place. So by taking this data, how do you unwrap that decision process to figure out how the system would behave if you apply a different decision or a different policy? This policy embedding in the existing data is very complicated in terms of inference, and I think it's a problem that has halted a lot of work in this area.
I would just like to jump on to that idea of what's already baked into data, and I think this is sort of one of the biggest challenges with working with cities who want to use data-driven decision-making, is this myth of the neutrality of data, that the data that you're getting is both one, complete, and that it's neutral, so it's been generated through a completely value-free data generation process, which is, of course, not true. More and more people are talking about, for example, the bias in AI, but there is always going to be social values embedded within data. Even the simple idea of categorizing someone's race is a social value. Categorizing someone's gender is a social value. So one is recognizing that. A lot of policymakers don't necessarily want to recognize that problem. And the second is, of course, as we said, completeness. So volume of data doesn't necessarily, especially when you're studying cities, volume of data doesn't necessarily cancel out its incompleteness, especially if that incompleteness is not random. So if there's certain kinds of populations that are being represented in, for example, Instagram data or Twitter data, just because you have 1 million records doesn't mean that the data suddenly becomes random, and that's a huge problem, again, in inference. And the third problem that I've personally run into is this difference between pattern recognition versus explanation. So while we can generate some wonderful patterns of urban behavior and infrastructural use using data, can you actually do you have the theories to start explaining some of those patterns, right? And without that explanation, can you then make policies just based on those pattern recognition? And that's sort of, I think, some of the concerns that I always have.
Those are very interesting points. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, these are extremely interesting points. I'll try actually to summarize or give you share with you some lessons that we learned from our different collaborations at QCRI with different government agencies in Qatar. So we're extremely lucky to be working with the Ministry of Transport and Communication, Ministry of Public Health, and different transport companies like taxi companies, different startups that collect sorts of traffic and mobility data. And we've been trying actually to help different ministries integrate this data-driven aspect into their decision process or decision-making workflows, basically. And yeah, while the data has been always, central to decision-making processes, I think the one we are talking about today is different in terms of scale of data, nature of data, in terms of processes that are required in order to make that data actually usable and available to the ones who are going to analyze it. So let me give you this one example. We work with the Land Transport Planning Department in Qatar. These are people who are in charge of building and maintaining the National Master Plan of Traffic and Land Transport, So in most of their projects, actually, the first step is always to generate data, and the way they do it, they would pay some consultancies to conduct population surveys. Now, population surveys are extremely expensive. I think the cost is around $100 per one survey, and that you can't make survey for millions of people. You have to sample your population, whether like 10,000, 50,000, and then you try to extrapolate some information. Now, what we try to do is to use some what we call unsolicited data. So the data you generate or you collect from surveys is solicited data in the sense it has been collected to serve a particular goal and objective. In this sense, for instance, you can create this data in order to build OD matrices, like demand OD matrices for people who work in civil engineering and transport engineering departments. However, we could try to leverage other sources of data, like CDR data, that telco companies have about us. Like every time, we use our cell phones, these actually are connected to different cell towers, and they tell about the location that we are in. So from this data, we can know where people live, where do they work, what kind of activities they have throughout the day, etc. Now, this actually department asked us to run some experiment on using a huge amount of traffic information, traffic trajectory data generated by different taxi companies and CDR data. We did it, we provided the OD matrices. And then they said, oh guys, can you come and deploy the system that you built in our on-premise? We said, yeah, sure. And as soon as we started talking to their IT departments, we realized actually that these guys are not qualified to satisfy the kind of demand and requirements that we have. So IT departments in ministries are good to help people print documents, make sure they can send emails, They provide this help desk kind of support. However, if you tell them, guys, we need 4 servers, connected to 20 terabytes of data with Hadoop or Spark, and some machine learning libraries like Scikit or TensorFlow, they are not the right people. They don't know what you are talking about. So there is this big challenge, which is an infrastructural challenge. Like these organizations are not ready, actually. They don't have the skills to have at least the infrastructure. The second big challenge is the know-how and qualification in terms of data scientists. Like, we build models, we handle them over to traffic engineers and civil engineers, and these guys don't have a clue on how to run regression on scikit-learn, for instance, or how to retrain an LSTM model on TensorFlow. So this is the second model. The third model is usually also and this is something that we faced with other stakeholders, has to do with the policies. Like, people would have problems, but they wouldn't be able to get data, right? And here, actually, I can echo what you just mentioned. Like, I remember the Obama administration, actually, when it first came, they appointed for the first time a CIO, like Chief Information Officer. And I think that this is very important, and maybe our cities should kind of replicate this model to make sure that we have very high-level people whose mission and KPI would be to make sure that open data is there and data is shared across and among different departments within the city.
So before I move to the next points, I want to summarize, because there are a lot of information, great information from our panelists about this question. So the main key points I would say is that collecting the right data for the right task, right? You might get a source of data that you think it's great, but it's not suitable for what you want, for explaining causal models and inferring models, decisions from that. There's the problem of infrastructure. So you are the data science or the software engineer who does the model, but nobody else is there in the company to implement what you did. But all of those questions kind of seem that if the top decision makers, whether it's in governance, government or public institutions or in private institutions, are the one who have the task to basically lead from the top to the bottom this revolution within their institutions. So before, that was not something I was going to ask you about, but if you have an idea, what do you think should be done to basically convince top governance agencies, as well as maybe some companies that are not necessarily in the space of data, to adopt data? So basically invest in infrastructure, invest in data scientists, invest in revolutionizing their companies and their agencies by having the infrastructure for data. Do you have any ideas about how we can do that? Maybe academic roles and academic role in this particular revolutionization.
So I guess I have a slight disagreement with the framing that the problem, well, one of the problems 100% is that we don't have enough people, especially in the global south, who are working, who would be able to bring the kinds of skills that people at MIT, technical skills that people have. But the problem isn't necessarily, as we talked about, that we need more data scientists. We do need more data scientists, but we need data scientists or people who understand data, but also understand cities. Because the concern right now, as we're talking about, is that we have data, but the data we have is not necessarily in its ideal state. Not in that it's not random enough or that it's not large enough, but that we need people using that data who understand the social biases of data creation, who understand the way, who understand theories of urban behavior, who understand theories of infrastructure use. And that's one concern, even at MIT, when we talk about collaborations, coming from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, I hardly know of any professor who's working with, for example, professors in IDSS or in CS on research collaborations. So these kinds of silos of data on one side, social scientists on the other side, I think is one of the biggest challenges that we have to surmount. We can have people who have technical skills, we can have data scientists, and I think they're extremely important. But as we now see with the kind of concerns coming out at Silicon Valley, if we leave decision-making just to people who have a specific kind of training, I would say that's a problem.
So that's a great point. So basically you're saying it's not necessarily only, we should only care about the top management who are more in the business. We also, the data scientists themselves, need to have an understanding of social science. So it's not only in one way, it's actually both ways. Interesting. Dr. Munther.
Yeah, I mean, I want to emphasize that point, and I want to say that interpretable models are very important, and working with people in the domains is really important. Data scientists are not going to acquire the knowledge in every field, and the collaboration has to be from the beginning, and you have to have the whole supply chain. But I want to go back actually to another point, another pain that I think is really critical, and that is the term data scientist itself and what that means. So right now, coders, people who can use Python, people who can just sort of look at a drop menu and use TensorFlow are building models based on data. And there's these people are, I don't want to generalize, but a lot of people are agnostic to the whole notion of uncertainty and errors and how bad these models are. And particularly as you're talking about biases and so forth, and yet, science papers and PNAS paper are written without any attention to the question of uncertainty. The problem with big data is that it's not that it's a lot of data. It's a lot of data about a lot of stuff. So that is that if you take one thing, you don't have a lot of data. Just think about the notion of big data being in a network. You've got a network of people, say a Facebook network or 1 billion people in there. There's a little data on each person. So the data is big, but if you focus on one person, there's not enough data. So if you start building models of behavior of that particular person, the uncertainty bounds are going to be large unless you have real understanding of how these different data sets affect each other. You got to do the analysis right. That's the world of statistics. It's called high-dimensional statistics. And that is not necessarily in the qualification of a data scientist, right? And that is very important. Back to your question, if companies are going to adopt data science as a way of doing things, they need to see some success stories. And there's a fear that there's a lot of failed stories and success stories before that happens.
Yeah, I think I'm in full agreement with what you just said, actually. And I have like story, like we collaborated, like, again, with the Ministry of Transport and Communication, with the transport actually division there, and at some point we created this ETA matrix for them. So we tell them the time it takes to go from every single transportation zone to every single other transportation zone. Different hours of the day, different days of the week, just to catch up the patterns. And then when we went to explain actually the results, they were asking about some pairs of zones, and we told them, yeah, it takes 23 minutes. And then the guy was asking like, yeah, what's the delay time? I said, we don't know. Like, it takes 23 minutes to go from A to B. So for them, traffic engineers, what they needed is decomposition of that time into delay time and then running time, and something that we were completely agnostic to because we are not traffic engineers. What we cared about was what is the time it takes me to go from A to B, and this is the number we see on Google Maps, on Apple Maps, and so on and so forth. So of course, it's extremely important actually to work with domain experts and to try to start the thing from the very beginning to make sure that you are aware about, the know-how and the knowledge that's specific to that domain. Now, the way to move forward, in my opinion, would be for academia actually to invent this new kind of cross-disciplinary or cross-department positions by doing some sort of, joint appointments of professors who would be teaching in urban sciences and computer science, or transportation science and computer science, and so on and so forth, to make sure that the students actually are trained to both kind of disciplines, and whenever they are called to build models or to retrain models, they would have at least, the basics on how to retrain these models, but at the same time, they should be aware and fully aware actually about the extent of, the specificities of the domains they are trying to model.
That's perfect answer, actually, because my next question was going to be about the academia, but since you probably mostly actually answered my question, I actually want to open the floor to our audience. So I see some familiar faces in the data-driven decision space, so I actually expect a lot of questions from you guys. So who's the one who's actually working the mic, just to make sure that somebody's there? Thanks.
I was going to ask, as we collect more and more data to feed into our models, as we're collecting more and more data to feed into our models and build data-driven decisions, the question of data ownership, privacy, and legality and accountability comes up.
Yes. So you're mostly asking question about how do we share data? What does it mean owning a data set? So I think maybe. Yeah. Right? Is that what the question is about?
Yeah, and how do we set the policies for data ownership, and the fact that we are sharing our data as we walk around, people know where we're going, how we're going, what we're using, what we're eating, what we're buying. All of this is data we're generating, and companies are leveraging it. And the question is, where do we draw the line of what's ours, what's private, how it's used in models, and how these models are kind of feeding into an ecosystem where.
Okay, so I would summarize that mostly in the issue of ownership of data, of ethics,
ethics of
and
data.
Privacy, security. So all these questions can actually come with data. I will just, maybe Dr. Munther, if you want to talk about your initiative with sharing data, market sharing.
Sure. I would say that, first of all, this is a very difficult question, and it doesn't have a unique answer or one answer, but we'll throw some thoughts about this. The digital world has presented a lot of challenges about ownership, privacy, ethics, and so forth. Not that ethics itself as a field is evolving, but that the questions have changed. In my past life at MIT, I was the chair of the Committee on Discipline. And don't ask me why I got there and how I got there. But one of the interesting cases we had was, a kid that actually, one of the students, that went to the faculty member and told him that they've prepared this MOOC. And he said that, if you just type this URL, you get into the locker and you can see all the problem sets and the solutions. And the professor was very angry at the student. And told him, just, don't do anything, we'll fix this problem, and sent an email to the class saying, we fixed the problem. The same student now typed a slightly different URL and downloaded all the stuff on his laptop and went to the professor and said, look, not only here it is, it's all on my laptop. The professor called the Committee on Discipline and wanted to expel him. And then I was confronted with this dilemma, right? The student was trying to help you. The faculty lost their mind because they've been working on the material for 2 years. But then, and then we got into this argument, is that was the student violating any ethical issues? And I'm saying, no, he's helping you. He's telling you that if you type a simple URL, you can get into the website. He said, look, if I leave my office open and there's an exam inside the office, it doesn't mean that you can go into my office and read the exam. And I told this guy not to go to the URL, and he should not have gone to the URL. And as a result, he violated an ethical issue. And it dawned on me that there's an interesting question that we haven't dabbled with. I still dismissed the case. I didn't think he should be got there, you know, and that professor is still angry at me. But the point is that I think this presents a very complicated world for us. And computer scientists, you know, my own department, are at ease with the idea that if I can grab the data, it's mine. You know, if I can do a search, NLP search on the web, and I can scrape this data off, then it's mine, you know? At the same time, they're the same people who would go in sort of heavy-duty research about secure environment where you cannot scrape the data, right? So you've got this ethical, you know, sort of dichotomy in the research itself, right? People who are willing to scrape and people who are willing to build secure system, and both talk to each other, and both are at harmony with that issue, right? You know, and just to kind of echo your issue, we have $100 billion advertisement market that is predicated on your data, you know? Your data is being taken out of your, you know, they're tracking your mouse movement and your keyboard and every cookie that comes in from every website that you search and so forth, and that's being sold, and then advertisement is being made to you. And so we've been, at IDSS, we've been thinking very hard about the question of, at some point, giving you ownership of your data, grabbing the data ahead of time before someone grabs it, but allow these companies to query that database in a data sharing platform where then you have a choice of what you want to release from your data. You are responsible for what you think. So if I want to give my data because of important cancer research, I may want to do it for nothing. In fact, I may pay and go give it. But for example, if you're going to use my data in order to offer my friend a recommendation on shoes and so forth, hey, maybe I want to get a little bit of that discount that you're giving them, right? And so I don't know what the baseline is, but I need to regain that ownership. And that's the whole idea of creating a data sharing marketplace, and that's what we've been thinking about.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, maybe. Actually, the question is extremely interesting, and I think that it has some very deep societal ramifications. Like, who sets the lines? Who sets the rules? Is it the startups that are in the West Coast, or is it the government who should have should work very quickly and set some sort of legal framework to make sure that companies can't abuse the data that belongs to us, that in the first place that we are generating as citizens, right? But then I don't know if you remember this whole Cambridge Analytica scandal, and then the hearing that happened here in the U.S. and it's definitely that the pace at which startups and companies are operating is 10 times faster than what government can do, and government and society is more in the reactive mode, and we should be more proactive. Now, to be more proactive, we need to have people who understand what is data, what is privacy. But then when you look at the questions that were asked to Zuckerberg, I mean, who are you? What are these questions? So, and then there's also this, societal choices. Like, you are in the US, you are more into this liberal kind of society. Europe is more conservative, and we see that Europe are more, hard on legislations, on laws regarding people data. So I think this is a very interesting question, and people should debate about it, and maybe put pressure on governments and not let this question be at the hands of just CEOs in the West Coast who should decide and tell us what is good and what is bad in terms of data.
I guess just to add very, very quickly, I would actually like to turn the question back to the audience and have everyone individually think, do they know what's happening with their data? So there is this concern of information asymmetry. If, let's say, I know that my data is going to be used for cancer research, I might be okay with it, but will I ever know the exact details of what kind of information will be used, how will it be used, who will use it, and then will it be secure enough for someone else to not use it? So, Google might have stored some data sets. I might, for some reason, trust Google, but what happens if someone else gets access to it? So there's a problem of information asymmetry here. The second thing is, if, let's say, the information asymmetry problem was resolved, would all of us be okay with, let's say, paying $10 per month to use Facebook so that our data is not monetized? That's also a cultural shift that will have to happen. I've had arguments with a lot of my friends on this who say that the problem is people are used to free stuff on the internet. I would argue the problem is that people just have never been given the choice, and they've never been informed about what exactly is happening with their data. So Facebook might tell you now that you're getting this recommendation because like you interacted with something similar, similar posts, but that's still not enough. So I think unless we start thinking about how exactly we want our data to be used, what are the extents that we will go to have our data be protected, and what is the trade-off between us willing to pay, what is the dollar value, I guess, that we place on our privacy and on our data? I think that's an important question.
I think that's an excellent point. It actually brings me back to the role of regulation and how, for example, depending whether in Europe or in the United States, regulation can have actually a different role. So, for example, here in the United States, as long as the big cartels, the big companies have basically provide free services, they are not necessarily harming the user. That's actually something different in Europe. So that's why the regulation is much more powerful there than here. So maybe by actually monetizing some of those services, we can no longer have some of those problems with ownership of data security here in the United States. So just something I wanted to make.
But can I follow up on that? I think it's an interesting point because we have a data sharing company in, for example, 23andMe.
Right.
And that's a really good example because you pay. Actually, you pay to give your data, which is interesting. But you pay, and then you're given some recommendation, some result. Like they'll tell you where you were born, with a very, very large uncertainty bound. So I was told I was born in North Africa, and I was born in the West Bank, and so I was perplexed by that result. That's just a side comment. And so I found out that the segment of North Africa does actually include Palestine, Jordan, and all the way up to Iraq. So, okay, so I didn't get much data from there. But it's interesting because you are entirely giving your data for this service, but they are using the data for some other things, and you don't know what they're using it for. There is a fine print in there saying that we will never use this data to harm you. And that was very interesting. Felt very good about that myself. Because I don't want to be harmed by my own genetic data. Well, but then, and another interesting thing happened where 23andMe or some other genetic company, because they didn't disclose, was actually the reason how we caught the Golden State Killer. And we all felt very happy about that. My God, okay, this was a great discovery. Genetic companies have actually been able to zero into this guy, but they violated that little thing, I don't know why that person actually gave their genetic makeup, but that is a separate issue.
It's actually a family member.
It's a family member. It was a family member. But the point is that they violated, and we don't know yet how, we're happy with that particular violation, but in general, you don't know. Maybe they use it in cancer research, which then I'll feel good about. They discover a rare disease I have, and then my insurance shoots up, and I have no control over it, right? So we are always concerned about these kind of what appear to be unintended consequences, but maybe mismanagement of the data sets that we get.
Can we go to the next question? Maybe, yeah.
Thanks. I have actually, you started touching on that. So on part, the regulations are different depending on which country you are from. So that also depends on what companies and governments can do about your data. But at the same time, if you look at it, data itself, depending, for example, if we use it for transportation or anything else, can also be used against a group of people. Especially if we're talking about the MENA region, we know that democracy is not the common word. So how do you see in a way using data to improve the lives of everybody, but at the same time kind of guaranteeing that actually it's for the benefit of everyone? Because if we look at it, you mentioned, for Facebook or 23andMe or so on, they have enough data to actually track and target every single one of us. But at the same time, if you are, if they decide to flip it and then like go like to harm people directly or indirectly, they totally can, and they can like, destroy lives and so on. So is there like a kind of a approach where we can like share data, use it in a beneficial way, but like keep it anonymous enough that it can only be used for the good for the human being rather than the opposite?
For example, healthcare. That's maybe one of the reasons.
Without the insurance.
Same exact question. Since like I don't want to repeat it. Exactly, just getting political here when it comes to the MENA region. Regimes and governments, like after the Arab Spring, maybe since they stayed in power, maybe the next level is going to actually they use the data or be smart about using data to sustain more power, like to actually try to prolong their governance. So like what will be the way actually for any tech or big companies in the MENA region actually to protect that from happening? What will be the moral responsibility here?
Thank you.
Well, I will just try to.
Answer
I don't think I have.
like.
I don't think I have like technical answer to this question. I'm from Algeria, and there's like that very beautiful revolution that's taking place right now. Millions of people taking to the street, and I would disagree in the sense that I think that governments are completely overtaken by what's happening in social media and social platforms. So these people are extremely old, and they have no control over whatsoever. It's just they are observing, and their solution would be for so long to prevent people from getting access to these platforms. Like they didn't want, for instance, to use 3G, and we had access to 3G like a few years back only, like 3 or 4 years ago, and then 4G like 1 year ago, and they were scared of this. They have no control over social media. Social platforms are definitely like very good, open, transparent to some extent. Platforms where people could share opinion and get organized and stuff. However, in terms of protection, I think for the end user, for the citizen to feel protected in terms of its data and stuff, you just need to have democracy. You need to have transparency. You need to have like a very strong civilian society and associations and stuff who could fight for you, who could have exert some pressure on governments and to make sure that data is not misused. And yeah, that's what I think. So if you are under an umbrella of an authoritarian, regime, then I'm afraid there isn't much you could do. I don't know.
All right. I think because there have five more minutes, I would like to get another question because I think we went ahead with this particular topic, maybe from that section.
Yeah, my question is, how do you approach the black box nature of most of the deep learning and machine learning models that we develop, especially given that there are certain industries where it's very sensitive not to know how the decisions are made through these models, like healthcare and whatnot?
So sorry, I will just really quickly talk about the previous question also, and then both of them, because they're just difficult questions, but very important questions, and especially at a place at MIT, we should be talking about these things. So very quickly, I will say that one, we shouldn't be complacent about the fact that just because, as you said, that our government officials are too old, they don't understand data, even if they don't, someone will come along soon enough who will understand it and who will use it. We saw this, and information has been weaponized against citizens for decades. One of the most famous example is the Holocaust, where government census were used to target very particular neighborhoods to find people. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think there's both, again, as with any other thing, there's both a technical component but a social component. The technical component of things like data privacy would be better forms of de-identification, better forms of encryption, better privacy infrastructure in place. But then there's a social element of, one, not only making sure that your government is accountable, but also making sure that conversations around privacy are happening in, and kind of contextualized privacy, not borrowing language from the US or the West and saying, oh, this is what privacy means everywhere. So that needs to be contextualized. Sorry, this is a very, very quick answer to something that's really, really broad, but yes, surveillance is a huge problem. In terms of the black box nature, I'm trying to like hit all the points very in like 5 minutes. The black box nature of algorithms, I think this is again like a debate that I have with one of my friends who is an IDSS graduate. And so some people feel like that it's not a problem, that only people who are technical enough to understand the algorithms should be talking about them, and that this is a technical issue. So the problem is that the general public just doesn't understand how the algorithm is made. I obviously don't think that's true, especially when the algorithms are being used to, for example, assess the risk of someone committing a crime again, and then when the resultant risk says that African Americans are at a higher risk, you sort of question, like, well, how is this decision made? Was this just the fact that the data that they were using was historically biased against certain populations, et cetera, like super famous example. So I think the first, again, push needs to come from all of us to hold companies more accountable, to push for more transparency. I think already we're seeing things like with the uproar with facial recognition systems, for example. Google is now creating this ethics panel, AI ethics panel. You may or may not disagree. You may or may not agree with that, the composition of that panel, but I think there are steps. Those conversations are finally happening, and I think that's amazing. MIT is pushing for more interdisciplinary majors, so the education element of that is important. But I think in general, the responsibility, unfortunately, just comes on all of us, employees of Google, employees of Facebook, employees of Uber, and people and users to sort of push for more transparency in those things. And of course, I understand that with like things like neural networks, even people who are using them don't necessarily always understand them. So I am not an expert on that, so I don't know how you would solve that. But on the other side, I think we just need to push, have those conversations and agree that a lack of transparency and the black box is a problem.
I have 1 minute left, and I would like to ask Dr. Munther to basically summarize, or if he has anything to say, as the last speaker of the
Oh, thank you. This is very difficult to summarize, but I will answer, just follow up on Rida's comments. Anonymization doesn't work. And so, and it's just a matter of time before you can invert and figure out who's who. Encryption codes and so forth, they can be de-encrypted, and at some point they fail. So all of this stuff and technology is great to have, but they have sensitivities and they break down at some point. And I think ultimately it's a social behavior of not abusing data. People have abused data all along, and they continue to do that. We abuse technology, we do that. I was giving an example to someone earlier. It wasn't about ethical education that was lacking, that we had to recognize that the nuclear bomb killing 150,000 people in one day is a problem. It's not an ethical education. That is an issue of abusing technology and so forth, right? And when I say that, I'm glad that people are sensitive about neural networks and they're not using them all the time and they're asking for interpretable data and models, because blind modeling is scary. If you're using it to make recommendations for shoes and pants and so forth, go for it. I have no problems with that. But if you're using it to decide, for example, sentencing problems in courts, and how are you going to, figure out what, the risk factors of which neighborhood you're walking around and so forth, then I would say it's just a pure memorization, and it's going to give us exactly all the stereotypes that we are trying to fight. And I think we should be very cognizant of that issue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Munther. Thank you all for staying here. We actually tackled questions that relate to data from, I think, all particular sides. I think that maybe the final word would be that to push for interdisciplinary research, to push for more awareness about what kind of data we share, and to push for more regulations as well. And what better place to talk about this than MIT? So thank you so much for being here.